The DoubleZero network is a physical infrastructure network, and by that, it's comprised of, at this point, over 70 different fiber links all around the world. If you go to doublezero.xyz/dashboard, you can actually see all of these network links in real time. You can see their latency, their gigabits per second, all this performance data around them. But this is like a physically interconnected mesh around the world. And so when we say that 26% of Solana is operating on the DoubleZero network, we don't mean that they've all interacted with some smart contract and they're sort of in some liquid staking pool or something like that. What we mean are the individuals and companies around the world that operate the thousands of nodes that make up the Solana network have decided we are going to effectively plug our servers into the DoubleZero network in addition to being plugged into the public internet.
What's up, everyone? Welcome to Fully Diluted. I'm your host, Dylan Bane, on the Enterprise Research Team, along with Matt Nay. Today, we're joined by Austin with DoubleZero, one of the largest TGEs of 2025 and most exciting projects that we're seeing this year, at least in the deep in space. Without further ado, we'll let Austin give a quick intro on himself and just maybe a high-level overview on what DoubleZero is.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm Austin Federa. I'm one of the three co-founders of DoubleZero, and I run the foundation side of things over here on the project. Before DoubleZero, I spent the last about little over 4 years at the Solana ecosystem, running strategy at the Solana Foundation, and before that, working on product and marketing over at Solana Labs.
Awesome, very cool. For listeners who might be not so familiar with DoubleZero and it might be a little overwhelming at first glance, could you just give like a quick high-level overview of what you're doing, like what problem you're solving?
Sure. So DoubleZero set out to solve one of sort of the biggest unsolved and uneven conceived of addressing categories in the blockchain space, which is the performance of the public internet. The public internet is a great resource, but like Matthew, you're kind of pixely at the moment on my side of things. It's not necessarily suitable for all of these high performance use cases that we try and use it for nowadays. Even a company like Zoom routes over the private networks for a lot of the data work that they do. But everything in blockchain runs on the public internet today, from Bitcoin, doing very few things very slowly and using a proof of work system, to Ethereum, to Solana, to Aptos, to Sui, to Monad, to MegaETH. They're all running over the public internet nowadays. And the public internet really was never built for this type of high performance environment. And you really can tell this by there's no major financial firm in the world that uses the public internet for trading. And this is extended as far down to, obviously Google and Amazon and Facebook run giant private networks, but even companies you wouldn't expect like PayPal and eBay, even companies like eBay run private networks because the public internet can't keep up with what they need to do. And eBay is like a 25-year-old auction website. It's not groundbreaking AI research or anything along those lines. And so really the whole point of the DoubleZero project is to provide this neutral base layer infrastructure that uses the same tools and technologies that traditional finance and big tech companies have been using for decades at this point, but do it in a way that brings cryptographic assurance, that brings censorship resistance, has multiple independent network contributors to the system. So it is keeping with the values and principles of blockchain, and also has the same trust or lack of trust verifiability paradigm that you would expect from any type of blockchain system.
Very cool. Thanks for that. So I'd love to talk a bit more about your traction so far, where DoubleZero is. I think I saw 36% of Solana mainnet stake is now operating on DoubleZero. Could you explain what that means and what's the status of the network right now?
So the DoubleZero network is a physical infrastructure network. And by that, it's comprised of, at this point, over 70 different fiber links all around the world. If you go to doublezero.xyz/dashboard, you can actually see all of these network links in real time. You can see their latency, their gigabits per second, all this performance data around them. But this is like a physically interconnected mesh around the world. And so when we say that 26% of Solana is operating on the DoubleZero network, we don't mean that they've all interacted with some smart contract and they're sort of in some liquid staking pool or something like that. What we mean are the individuals and companies around the world that operate the thousands of nodes that make up the Solana network have decided we are going to effectively plug our servers into the DoubleZero network in addition to being plugged into the public internet. It really is very similar to like if you ever went to a LAN party when you were younger and like you bring your computer and you plug it into the local area network and suddenly you're all gaming together. You're not gaming over the public internet. It is exactly that same type of concept, just on a global scale with, billions of dollars of assets moving around, not, Counter-Strike. And that's kind of one of the really cool parts about this is this can coexist with the public internet. And so it's not an all or nothing decision. If the fastest route is through the DoubleZero network, the validator can talk out the DoubleZero network to other validators around the world. If it happens to be through the public internet, they can do that as well. And so that's kind of the core idea behind this is we're going to, over time get hopefully one day 100% of Solana operating on the DoubleZero network. And at that point, we can roll out to all validators a whole bunch of technologies that are just not available on the public internet. And this really comes out of the desire to get Solana going to 1 million transactions per second and get every blockchain is capable of it going to the maximum amount of throughput that they can support. And this is kind of a really big component because when the folks at FireDancer started working on the FireDancer client, they were like, we can build a validator client that can do 1 million transactions per second, but we can't run it on the public internet. And, a bunch of us were sort of like, oh, what do you mean? What's the point of this thing? And they're like, well, you want a sports car that can go 200 miles an hour, even if you can never actually drive it that fast, because it really improves the performance of sort of the 0 to 60 or 0 to 80 as well. And it's like, okay, like I can sort of understand that, but like, can't we run it at like 160 miles an hour at least then, right? And so this is kind of where the idea for DoubleZero originally came from, is could we build a faster alternative to the public internet that would allow these software clients, which now Solana has 2 extremely performant validator clients, the Agave client and the FireDancer client, to actually reach their true potential and not be limited by the public internet.
You touched on something there where you said you had 17 cables that I kind of want to like ask, like just growing the network. How does that process work? Are you guys, I don't think you are, but like hopefully one day soon, I know from just listening to some of the other talks, like going and physically laying this cable down, how does that process work? Like going to access these cables and because I think for a lot of us here, we're just clicking buttons on screen and trading coins. Like, what does that look like when you're going to the real world and say, hey, we want some of this physical cable fiber networks to like actually run these transactions? So like talk about that process and like how tough was it to get number 1 and has the rest of the 16 been and like and what's the end state? How many cables are you going to need and kind of like that physical layer of the DoubleZero network?
Yeah, totally. So we actually have 70 different pieces of fiber contributed to the DoubleZero network from 11 independent contributors. And so those kind of are two of the really big important components. So our first network contributor to the network was actually Jump Trading. And so they run obviously a global high performance network for their own trading activities. And we convinced them to give us a small portion of that as the initial DoubleZero network. And so once we got the first network contributor on board, it was much easier to get other ones because, it's the overlap between like hardcore networking and crypto is basically just DoubleZero. There's extremely little overlap between these two. There's actually very little overlap between high performance networking and even Web 2 software for the most part. These are largely 2 very different worlds. One is really focused on minute performance optimization, and it's much closer to the type of engineering you'd have in like the 60s and 70s and 80s building like a fighter jet or like the B-2 bomber or something like that. It's all about like how can you simplify components down to their base amounts? How can you do it as quickly as possible? And it's very similar to what you get in like a particle physics lab. And then you have kind of like modern Web 2 software engineering, which is like abstract concepts of scale. They're built at very high level abstraction so they can be built quickly, but not necessarily built performantly. And so, when we started working on this, getting, Jump to agree to be the first contributor really helped convince a lot of other companies that like, oh, Jump's like a serious engineering company. If they're paying attention to this, it's not just some weird crypto overlay mesh network or something along those lines. This is actually something that, we should be paying attention to. So each additional contributor that comes on board, some of them have like ownership of the fiber. Some of them are on long-term leases of the fiber, and some of them are on just more standard shorter term leases. And so we at the DoubleZero Foundation actually operate none of the fiber. It's all provided by the contributors, the same way that, the Solana Foundation doesn't operate validators and the Ethereum Foundation doesn't operate validators either. And so that process of growing out the network, it's a mix of looking where are validators currently, like where are blockchains currently run? Where do we think they could be run in the future? And probably most importantly, where would people like to run them that they currently cannot because of the limitations of the public internet? So at the moment, I'm down in Buenos Aires for Staking Summit and DevCon down here, and we now have brought fiber into Sao Paulo in Brazil and have an extension leg down to Argentina that's going in soon. And that's going to make it possible for the first time for folks in South America to profitably run Solana validators, because the public internet path, maybe it's worth a little deviation into like the public internet in South America. So if you are in Argentina and you're trying to talk to someone in Chile, your data clears through Miami, which is crazy. These are two countries, I mean, they're separated by a mountain range, but they're right next to one another. This is the same thing of like Ecuador to Brazil. It probably clears through Miami, because that's the path and that's the route that all of these subsea cables took. And so you might look at something on the map and say, hey, these things are really close to one another. This should be really performant and easy. But there's either not many cables moving that direction, or the cables that are going that direction are private fiber cables. So, for example, there are cables that go from the easternmost edge of South America over to the westernmost edge of Africa. They're very inaccessible to public internet traffic. So primarily your data, if you're trying to talk, to someone in Africa, is going up and around through the United States, through Europe, and coming back down. And so even areas of the world that seem like they might be close, or you can look on a map, you can say, oh, there's a submarine cable map here. Oftentimes the data is taking a different pathway. And so this is the type of like localization of network infrastructure that we have to worry about at DoubleZero that validators shouldn't have to think about, but do. There was a routine cable maintenance a few months ago on a major line that goes between Tokyo and the western coast of the United States. And suddenly a bunch of validators in Tokyo, Solana validators, they were skipping blocks. They were missing, block building times, all this stuff. And they were like, what's going on? Was there a bad release of the software? Did we introduce some bug? And the answer was like, no, just the cable you were running on is now under maintenance. And so instead, your data from Tokyo is going all the way down through Singapore, all the way up around through India, all the way through the Suez Canal, then connecting into Europe, and then going over to New York. And so you're taking the longest pathway around the world possible to get from Tokyo to New York. This cable's offline. That shouldn't be something a validator has to worry about. But we've reached in theory, we've reached a level of high performant blockchain systems where they need to be thinking about this stuff now. Or at the very least, they need to be using DoubleZero. So we are thinking about this stuff now.
Awesome. Could you help quantify the improvements in performance unlocked by DoubleZero versus the public internet?
Sure. So the majority of validators nowadays have between a 1 and a 5 gig internet connection. Some of them go up to 10. Most links in the DoubleZero network are 100 gigabit global network links. But it goes kind of even more than that. There's this concept of least cost routing on the public internet, which is basically this idea that the data that transits over the public internet is not optimized for performance, it's optimized for cost. And this is great. This is why we don't have bandwidth caps anymore on our internet service plan. This is why your cell phone has unlimited data. This is why for $40 to $60 a month, you can download pretty much as you possibly ever want to download and stream. That is a marvel of capitalism in the modern internet, but it is made possible by sacrificing performant applications. And so if you do a trace route on, like me trying to talk to Singapore from New York or Tokyo or something like that, you may find that the data bounces around inside the United States 10 or 15 times before it actually transits over to Asia. And it may go actually directly to Singapore and then make its way up the coast before it actually gets to Tokyo. On the DoubleZero network, if you're transiting from New York to Tokyo, well, first off, you can go to the doublezero.xyz/dashboard. You can see the exact path your data is going to take, but it's probably going to go from New York to maybe Chicago, and then Chicago to LA, and then it's going to take a direct line from LA to Singapore. So suddenly you've got 3 hops instead of maybe 20 or 30 hops. And each time you are passing through a hop on the public internet, you're basically put into a queue. And a queue is exactly what it sounds like. It's like merging lanes on the highway. Even if you have two-lane roads merging into a 4-lane road, and there's technically enough room for all the cars, everything slows down because merging is just a process that slows everything down. And so this introduces something called jitter. And jitter is a measurement of how much latency changes over time. So you may say like, oh, the DoubleZero network has 110 millisecond latency and the public internet has, 180 millisecond latency. Like, okay, so we beat the public internet there, which is great. But if you ping, 10 times over the course of an hour, you might get 180, 160, 240, 390, 135. There's a huge amount of variance in the latency time that public internet provides because of all of this queuing. And so what that means is you lose predictability in systems. And when you lose predictability, you have to have larger buffers and caches both on your own system. So this is a real killer for high performance in blockchains and validators, but it's also a very bad experience for a trader. Because if you are, Galaxy or Wintermute or some market making firm and you're trying to get a cancel order in on chain, how long is it going to take to get to that leader? Well, it might be 300 milliseconds, it might be 900 milliseconds. It all depends on the performance of the public internet and the route that it happens to take and where in the world the block is being built. And so what do? You don't quote as tight. You have larger spreads in your quotes because you don't know exactly where the price is going to be, and you also don't know how long it'll take to update your quotes once that price comes in. So there's all sorts of things like that the public internet really like holds blockchain back on. And so, and this is before we're talking about the technology on the DoubleZero network that is just literally not available on the public internet. So there's a ton we can do, but the core principles of the DoubleZero network are there's going to be lower latency and very predictable, dependable latency. And also, it's going to have much fatter pipes, much greater capacity to move data than you get over the public internet.
You've mentioned a couple times that like technology that you guys can have that like might be blockchain specific. I once again listed as sometimes you talk like the FPGA stuff that you can kind of put on some of these rails as they're going. That was something that clicked for me as someone that doesn't know anything about this low level networking and fiber cables and everything. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Like what has the performance been so far? Are you waiting for 100% before that stuff clicks in for like going and like doing like sig verify stuff and like deduplication stuff like on the network and basically like what is that going to do for the validator perspective and like how much easier is that going to make their life as they're taking inbound of all these transactions? Because I think from someone that like once again doesn't know a ton about this, but that clicked for me instantly as how that just makes the validator's life a ton easier.
Yeah, definitely. So right now, things like sig verify and dedupe aren't needed in like the day-to-day operations of Solana. They can be done pretty well like on the validator itself, but in periods of like huge congestion or ingest, right? So like the flash crash is one example of this. There's sort of a few things to like keep in mind there. The first is that the jitter on the public internet spiked dramatically. We saw 60 milliseconds or more of jitter even in Central Europe during this flash crash. On the DoubleZero network, jitter remained functionally zero. And so we saw like that thesis of DoubleZero will provide a much more dependable connection structure was very much true. The sig verify and dedupe we're in the process of rolling out. It'll probably be sort of Q1 or Q2 because that is really about future-proofing the network. The FPGA acceleration is not really needed at the 10,000 transactions per second Solana's at now, but if we get up to 1 million transactions per second, that's when those sort of technologies really become useful. What we sort of are in the process of now is, as you might expect, someone like the Solana Foundation and Anza, they're leery of adopting new technology too quickly because, no one wants Solana to go down again. And so they need to get comfortable seeing the performance of the DoubleZero network before they start saying, okay, we're comfortable going faster than what the public internet will allow us to do. Right now, Solana is not trying to go faster than the public internet yet. It's starting to lay the groundwork to allow it to go faster than the public internet. And so, one of the nice things about the DoubleZero project is we can provide testing environments for engineers to sort of get more comfortable. But Solana is a very mature ecosystem. And that means that even if there's stuff that on a protocol level we're not ready to work on with DoubleZero, On the application layer, it's a very different story. So we've been working with Jito for months on BAM and ShredStream being possible over the DoubleZero network. We started onboarding RPCs last week. So, most of the major RPC providers are testing improvements over the DoubleZero network. And then we're also working with Temporal's new system, Harmonize, as well, or Harmonic as well, on their block building systems and being able to run that over DoubleZero. So I think we'll probably see, in some ways, like the actual Solana network layer adopt it probably later than we will see a lot of things operating on top of Solana. But that's actually a pretty fine way to roll it out. So, we're not going to see a million transactions on DoubleZero tomorrow simply because it's a slow and steady building process. But the cool piece is there are new networks we're working with that are saying from day one, we're just going to assume everyone's operating on DoubleZero. And we're going to assume we have 50 gigabits per second of connectivity to every validator and basically zero jitter and, very dependable latency, and basically see what we can do from there.
Yeah, and in terms of other L1s or blockchains that DoubleZero could potentially support, do you have any plans there, or is it really just, built for Solana?
It is built to support even non-blockchain systems. So this is what's called an OSI layer 1, 2, and 3 network. So it's way below the validator stack or the VM stack or anything like that. We've built a bunch of sort of side tooling to help support Solana. So for example, we can't just let anyone join the network, because that becomes a Sybil resistance problem. If we get a million concurrent connections on the DoubleZero network, that's going to cause some problems at the moment. So we have a whole bunch of software that basically queries Solana Gossip and says, hey, if you're a block builder in Gossip, great, we'll pull, allow you to join the DoubleZero network. So we need to basically build new provisioning software for each additional blockchain that wants to join. But that's a pretty easy, trivial process. If a blockchain wants to get the most out of DoubleZero, they need to modify their clients a little bit to support technologies like multicast and those sorts of things, because it's really important to reach the maximum performance and potential. We haven't really talked about multicast yet, but that's another new technology, new for blockchain, that has been used in TradFi for years, but is not available on the public internet. So, I would say we'll probably start rolling out support for new blockchains in Q1. And if folks are listening who are protocol engineers and want to talk, we would love to chat.
Yeah, you brought up multicast. That was going to be my next question going into Alpenglow, right? Like when the next upgrade or big upgrade that's coming to Solana, how does DoubleZero fit into that? Was you guys planning ahead, kind of knew that's where Alpenglow or the Solana network, the Agave client was going? And I guess also explain what multicast is, because maybe not everyone is familiar, but yeah, how does that fit into the Solana roadmap of Alpenglow?
So multicast is a really cool technology, which is basically hardware acceleration of packet replication and delivery. So right now what happens on Solana or Monad or any fast blockchain is you have basically a process of creating what are called of erasure coding and fan out. So my validator has built a block. I now need to get it out to the 7,000 nodes on Solana that all want to know, hey, what was in this block? So there's a few options here. The most simple one is, okay, I'm going to send it out 7,000 times. Well, that takes a really long time to do. So instead, what Turbine does is I'm going to send it to 200 of my best friends, and they're going to send it to 200, and they're going to send it to 200, and they're going to send it to 200. And that's basically how the Turbine fan out works. And after a few hops, because of exponential math, you get everywhere you need to go. And that's a really cool system. It works really well, considering it has to use the public internet and unicast. But a multicast network works in a very cool and very different way. So in a multicast network, the validator actually has to send out 2 copies of the data, and a multicast feed A and a feed B. And every single recipient who wants to subscribe to that multicast feed is basically announced to the network, hey, I'd like a copy of all this data. And so that data is sent over, and at close to the destination as possible is replicated. So think about it this way. If you have this theoretical model where you've got 1,000 validators in London and you've got one in New York, if that one validator in New York has built a block and needs to transmit it out, it's sending 1,000 copies of that data across the Atlantic. With multicast, it would only be sending 2 copies across the Atlantic, and then the switch would replicate that data when it arrives in London. So it saves bandwidth and it keeps the network from getting congested in the middle. But what's really cool about multicast is you can have multiple pathways of data flying around simultaneously. So A validator can be building a block and transmitting it here. Another one's building a block and transmitting it here. And all this data basically flies past itself in flight. And because it's only replicated when it gets as close to the destination as possible, you don't have this problem of suddenly we have hundreds of gigabits per second of data flowing around. We just have basically twice the size of a block floating around. And so multicast is like the technology that the major financial exchanges have used, again, for years to distribute pricing feeds. It also is much more fair. So one of the main principles of a TradFi system is it should be objectively fair. Now, we don't really think of TradFi as fair, but once you've already paid the money to get into the data center, and once you've already licensed and credentialed to trade on the exchange, it should be fair, is basically their argument. And so what that means is everyone gets the state updates at the same time from the market. And how do they make that happen? Well, they use multicast to make that happen.
Yeah, it seems like you're drawing a lot of, ideas and inspiration from TradFi. Do you think that TradFi itself could benefit from DoubleZero, use the network in a way that makes sense for them?
It depends, is my honest answer here. It's very easy to say, like, oh, of course, like all of TradFi will use DoubleZero. But realistically, you have companies like Jump and DRW and Citadel that have massive teams and massive budgets, and they've put that into optimizing latency and deliverability around key routes that really matter to them in financial markets. But if we take a step back, there's maybe 10 financial markets in the world that really truly matter at a global scale. It's not actually that many cities and regions you have to have wired up. You look at Solana, and just Solana alone is running over 300 data centers all around the world. And so I think what we'll see is we see a convergence of traditional finance and decentralized finance is, we may see a bunch of these traditional financial companies and traditional HFT firms adopting DoubleZero not as a replacement for their network, but to supplement the regions of the world that their network simply doesn't reach to. And I think that's one of the main areas we would sort of see a bunch of collaboration with traditional finance on the trading side. Now, it just so happens we have Jump and DRW at Cumberland as contributors to the DoubleZero network already. And so we do have a lot of those high performance networking Wall Street firms already connected in. But, it's one of those things where we'll see as things evolve. But our goal and the work we're doing now is to basically get DoubleZero plugged into every major exchange. So if you're trying to, run an arbitrage between Binance and Jupiter, like you will be using the DoubleZero network to transit all that data.
Yeah, you mentioned like these new networks and joining other major L1s that are high performant, and you mentioned Monad as an example. Like when a second L1 comes on the DoubleZero network and these transactions are going around, obviously they're not composable, they're different networks and everything. How does that work when they're like going through this highway, they're going through this subsea cable, and like, is this also going to bring that problem where you have to merge, and you're talking about like when you're merging the 2 lanes onto the 4 lanes? Like, What is it can all be fine? Like, is that okay? Like, are you guys not worried about that? Just kind of curious from like a high level point of view. Like, is that an issue, or is that just the DoubleZero network will be performant enough to kind of like handle the multiple networks? And like, is there a number of L1s that you can handle, or is it infinite?
Yeah. So one of the great things about blockchain is that data is actually fairly predictable. Right, blocks don't arbitrarily change in size, and yes, RPC traffic changes, of course, as there's more and less demand, and that's where some of the filtration stuff we talked about before can come into play. But one of the big things is the public ISPs run their fiber cables at like 90 to 95% capacity 24/7, because every little ounce of efficiency you can squeeze out of it is important. And if you drop some packets, who cares? It's the public internet. Like, am I really going to notice if a few pixels in your image temporarily flicker? Like, we're on a Zoom call, things happen, And so that mentality really has allowed ISPs to run these things at like near full capacity constantly. The DoubleZero network, we get uncomfortable if a link passes 60% utilization. And that's to allow huge amounts of burstable capacity on these network links, because our business model is fundamentally different. We're not trying to squeeze every little ounce out of a fiber link. We need that link to be dependable and predictable over the long term. So when a new tenant joins, we sort of refer to them as tenants, but when a new tenant joins the DoubleZero network, we're looking at and monitoring what are the traffic patterns and traffic flows of that new software system. And we can do 2 things. The first is we're putting it in its own like virtual network, for lack of a better term, on top of the DoubleZero network. So its traffic is segmented from like Solana traffic, and Solana traffic is therefore segmented from that. But the cool part about this is, let's say you are Messari, just for sake of argument, and you run some servers. And one of the things your servers do is they ingest data from multiple blockchains, and they produce analytics dashboards and research reports and all sorts of things like that. Well, what happens right now? You run a bunch of independent servers that are all participating as read nodes in Solana and Sui and Aptos and Monad and all these places. You could just pull in all those state updates as a multicast feed. And so your data ingest server can say, hey, I want to subscribe to the Solana data feed. I want to subscribe to, let's say, the Monad data feed as well. And suddenly, instead of having to do this process of running a bunch of infrastructure and, how far behind the tip of the chain is our RPC and all these sorts of things, you're just pulling in all the state updates that come from those networks. And so you do have this real network effect component of having more and more of these systems on the same network. This is really impactful if you're doing cross-chain swaps, if you're doing intense-based protocols like Near, if you're, you have like your Pith or your wormhole and you're trying to move data between chains pretty quickly. All of this basically just improves, you're a DA layer and you want to basically post all this data to a DA somewhere. All of this basically just improves how quickly data can move throughout these systems, which allow them to move faster than they can otherwise. So it's just, when we think about like the global data structure here, what we're trying to get away from is that each additional listener or node in a system today is effectively a bandwidth tax on the whole system. So if you have 2,000 nodes and then another one joins, suddenly that's one more delivery point that all of the network is responsible for sending data out to. With multicast, that additional node joining the network it's a tax on the DoubleZero network, sure, but it's not a tax on the actual validator network or the blockchain network. And so we can handle that tax on our systems because we provision more capacity. We work with our contributors to bring more connectivity into an area. And, you're going to charge for that multicast feed subscription anyway. But what it does is it basically moves the burden from a place in the stack that's not very well built to handle it, a bunch of independent validators trying to just build blocks, to a purpose-built high-performance network capable of handling this type of stuff.
I want to talk a bit more about the 2Z token. So, I think DoubleZero was announced sometime, I want to say in December of last year, and we had a TG this last October. Want to get a bit more into what's the utility of the token, why, launch the token maybe on a relatively fast basis, just like what is this token?
Yeah, so the 2Z token is the native token of DoubleZero network. It is the main way that someone pays for data and transit and seed fees and those sorts of things on the DoubleZero network. It is also the way that bandwidth contributors are rewarded for their contributions. And so there's a whole bunch of economics we can get into on exactly how this is all done. But the way that it's structured is effectively a validator pays in, and we have something called Shapley values, which is an economic concept that says, there's a network system. How much worse would the network be if I removed one component in it? And that is like a great way to determine what the incremental value of that additional link in the protocol is. This is not entirely different from how Bitcoin miners work, although I don't think of it that way. But if I'm a Bitcoin miner and I'm providing 10% of the hash power to the network, I'm going to get 10% of the rewards of the network over, like, averaged out over enough blocks. That's not true in proof of stake networks. If if my node has 5% of stake and your node has, 0.5% of stake, I'm not doing 10 times more work than your node is doing, but I'm getting 10 times the rewards. So we wanted to make sure that we had something, this is called proof of utility, where the reward rate was directly proportional to the value of the fiber that someone was contributing to the network. And that was kind of a major principle behind it. All of this requires having a token live. It's sort of like trying to launch an L1 without the token being live. You need the token for the L1 to be able to exist. I am also a big believer that if you ever intend to launch a token, you should launch the token at the very beginning of your product. Almost every retroactive token launch is either seen as unfair or superfluous, I would say. Because either you're changing the economic game, like Uniswap has been functionally free for years, but now a fee is getting turned on. that's a real change to the traders on it. If you have an NFT marketplace and you launch a token afterward, you're changing the core economics of how that marketplace works because you got to integrate your token into that thing as well. I think, or Jito has kind of run into a little bit of a different problem with their token, where the token's really was a great launch. They did a very strong launch of it, but it's been unclear how the value created by the Jito protocol is related to the Jito token, same as something like Metaplex. And so for us, we wanted to make sure, or I specifically wanted to make sure, that we are launching the token and the network on the same day at the same time, so that the token is functional on the network from day one and it is an integral part of the network. But also, we're not LARPing, because if you're not charging for something, it's very easy to have product market fit, right? Free stuff always has product market fit. A soup kitchen always has product market fit. The question is, when you ask people to actually pay for the thing, are they going to do it? And so the whole philosophy here was, if something is wrong in our model, I want to learn that really quickly. I don't want to learn that over the next 18 months. We got very quick feedback on, validators being like, hey, we're willing to pay for this. We don't think this is valuable, even if it shows up in performance metrics. And so we've had to adjust some of these models. And that sort of really fast feedback loop is really only possible both on the contributor and the user side when there's this strong monetary token alignment.
Yeah, I kind of want to touch on DZ Sol. So I was just checking the chart, and I cover Solana as a whole and write the quarterly, and I was just checking before this call, and I'm like, holy cow, it's the second biggest liquid staking token on Solana now. And so how does DZ Sol fit into that? I know you also have the staking delegation program that you might want to mention, and just where does the liquid staking DZ Sol token kind of fit into the economics of DoubleZero, and just how does that help bootstrap the network, and what are the incentives to use that to help get people to join?
Yeah, so DZ Sol is a really interesting solution to a problem that we sort of had, which was, if we're going to ask validators to pay 5% of their block rewards to operate on the DoubleZero network, well, today we're not making them 5% more block rewards. There's all these other ancillary benefits to the Solana network in general that we're providing, but the monetization is not there at the moment. We're bringing maybe 2 or 3 more percent, but we're asking for a 5% fee. And so the DoubleZero stake pool using DZ Sol is a way to basically effectively equalize those fees for validators. And so we'll say, hey, look, we'll stake a little bit of additional, Sol to your validator in exchange for joining. It's cost neutral for you, and you get to participate in this activity of laying the groundwork to get Solana to 1 million transactions per second. And so that Sol, that comes from investors and interested parties and supporters of us. The same way that on Ethereum, sometimes you'll see A16Z is the major liquidity provider for Uniswap because they own a bunch of the unit tokens, those sorts of things. But our metric we have to hit over the long term is, are we making validators more money? And that is our North Star goal. Is, yes, we have to make the network faster, but we have to do it in a way that every self-interested, selfish validator, and I say that in a good way, this is blockchain, this is capitalism, every validator should be self-interested and greedy, that every greedy, self-interested validator makes the rational choice to join DoubleZero because it makes them more money. It also has this effect of allowing Solana to go much more quickly than it would otherwise, but we really need to prove out that monetary thesis.
Matt, do you have a follow-up there?
Yeah, I was going to ask a couple, just if you have any timelines. When do you think Solana hits 1 million TPS? If you have any, it doesn't have to have any, it could be vibes based, I guess. But and also, I guess more directly tied to DoubleZero, when do you think that 5% will click, and what's the biggest step to get to that process?
Yeah, 1 million is a hard number to say. I would say 100,000 by the end of 2026 feels pretty programmed in. If that hasn't happened, I don't know, something will have gone wrong in the engineering process. And not to say there'll be demand for 100,000 TPS, but you will be able to run 100,000 transactions per second on mainnet. So, 1 million, call it maybe 2 or 3 years. That feels pretty reasonable, assuming again the demand exists to prioritize the engineering to get there, which I think is all pretty good. In terms of, on the DoubleZero side of things, every additional validator proves the thesis out a little bit more, and getting RPCs and Jito and temporal systems on DoubleZero should make new types of trades profitable that wouldn't be possible otherwise because of the reduced latency. And so that's kind of one of the core things we're testing now is how much is that improvement? What is the trader appetite there? And so I think we're not far away from those numbers being break even, but this is a major discovery process for us over the next few months and over the course of the first quarter of next year.
Yeah, what plans do you guys have for DoubleZero going into 2026? Like, what should we expect?
Yeah, multicast support will roll out on mainnet. We'll probably have the edge filtration system starting to get deployed as well. New tenants, so new blockchains and non-blockchain systems joining the DoubleZero network, and more fiber deployment. We've had a ton of new fiber deployment this year already. We've got a bunch of new stuff coming next year, including some new long-haul, very low-latency routes that are sort of purpose-built for traders. So there's a whole bunch of stuff coming in next year.
Nice. Looking forward to it. I guess kind of just want to get your take on like where Solana is today and like what you see. What have been like some of your favorite moments this year? Like were you a fan of the Launchpad wars and kind of where do you see Solana going into next year? Obviously, as a longtime Solana fan as yourself, like wondering like what's the biggest hurdle that needs to overcome? I know like perpdex might be the easy answer, but curious what your answer is.
Yeah, perpdex is the very easy answer. I also don't think it matters that much. I'm going to be honest. I think it's sort of like saying, was Ethereum doomed because it didn't figure out meme coins? No, right? Like these each one of these components is interesting and important. I would love to see a highly performant perpdex on Solana. If it doesn't happen, I don't think that for a little while, I don't think that's like a death sentence or actually that important. It's more about the larger composition of the ecosystem overall. Again, the same way that like there was no performant DeFi on Ethereum for a long time on any of the L2s. And, again, they survived just fine. So these are all components of a larger ecosystem story. I would say the industry right now is kind of struggling a lot in a lot of different places. The Ethereum scaling thesis has failed to return any monetary benefit to the Ether, the asset. Rev on Solana is way down compared to where it was at the beginning of the year. MicroStrategy just went negative NAV today or yesterday. A lot of the sort of theses we've been hanging our hat on in the industry have kind of failed to prove out. And that's normal. And that's actually good. And I think there's just a lot of churn right now as people sort of, there's this really strange thing we've noticed in the economy I'm not answering your question at all, by the way, feel free to cut me off. But like, there's this really strange thing we've noticed in the economy over the last few years. And this kind of started around COVID, where the more information a market gets, sometimes the worse decisions it makes. Like we saw these massive over ordering and overproduction and underproduction of all sorts of things in COVID that made like no sense. Like the factories that make like outdoor furniture overmade outdoor furniture by like 35%. Like at the end of 2021, you could pick up like $10,000 outdoor furniture for like $700 on sale because there was just such a massive overproduction. And then at the same time, you'll see things like, everyone scales back in the same area and then suddenly we need to buy a bunch more of the thing. And you have this very spiky cyclical shortage and overproduction structure going on, which we didn't used to happen because now everyone's looking at the same data and making the same decisions about it. And no one's actually communicating their actions out to the rest of the world. And so it's very funny because it used to happen in TradFi too, before they started multicasting their own trades to their own servers. They would have like a server in London and a server in New York bidding against one another effectively. These famous stories in the 2008 financial crisis of one side of the bank desperately trying to offload toxic assets and the other side of the bank happily buying them from the same division in the other side of the bank after they went through a broker. And so I think we're kind of there in crypto now where like the market sentiment moves every few weeks to sort of this new thing that's supposed to be holding the market up or this new doom spiral that's now pulling the market down. I think the truth is just like this is a long-term industry that's going to have to build slowly over the long term. And it's not about what is the new crazy trend. It's about what is durable products and durable innovation. And like, if you go back 2 years and you said like, hey, the SEC was going to be like unabashedly pro crypto, every major asset would have an ETF, many of them would have a staking ETF. We'd have like 10 MicroStrategies for other, things out there. The president of the United States would have launched a meme coin. Also, his wife would launch a meme coin. Also, like, you would have been like, okay, Bitcoin's going to be at like $2 million. I don't even know like how to think about these things. And instead, what we've seen instead is like there's a lot of fear in the macro economy, the macro world right now. And sometimes the crypto world is so introspective that they like forget that like Nvidia is down 10% also. And it's this really interesting piece where like for so long crypto has operated apart from the rest of the world. And by definition of having Wall Street embrace crypto, we are no longer separate from the rest of the economy. And I think it's going to be a while before people get used to that.
Yeah, in terms of those long-term products that you think are enduring, what's your opinion there? Like, what will DoubleZero ultimately be facilitating?
So the beauty of DoubleZero is it doesn't matter what wins. It's going to need low latency, high performant connectivity. And, when I left Solana, I did not want to build something that would be competing with Solana. And I also didn't want to just build a protocol on Solana. I wanted to build something that would advance this industry by 10 years or more in the next 2 years. And, for me, the way I could do that with my co-founders was high performant, low level networking to power this new wave of innovation. So again, another non-answer to your question. But if you think about like what are the durable components that have stayed throughout the crypto industry in general, like no risk counterparty trading of permissionless assets, DeFi very much has stayed. Store of value has very much stayed. The ability to run an arbitrary program on a network is still very valuable. I think like Solana has proven time and time again that you can do things at a scale and at a cost structure that actually makes them competitive with Web 2 that you could never do on blockchain systems before. I think that will continue to be an advantage, but suddenly like Mega ETH is pretty fast, Mana is pretty fast, Aptos is pretty fast, Sui is pretty fast. Like we're going to see this kind of renaissance in new ideas. Like there's this crazy new, like, I don't even know how to describe it. Have you seen the new Mega ETH app where it's like you guess where the chart's going to go? Like that thing's incredible. It's just like such a lizard brain, great product that someone's built. And like, that's just like, we're going to get 1,000 of those cool new ideas. The same way it took developers several years to figure out what to actually build on the iPhone. The first apps on the iPhone were like a fart button, a beer drinking simulator, a flashlight, and like a button that just says I'm rich that cost $1,000 to buy. Like it took us a while to figure out what apps we really should build, but then we got Uber out of it, then we got Tinder out of it, then we got all these other types of things. And I feel like we're just at the beginning of this for blockchain. So I remain hopeful on when you 10x capacity and you cost by 10x as well, you're going to get entirely new types of innovation no one thought was possible before.
Cool. I know we're running low on time. Matt, do you have any last questions before I wrap up?
No. Should we be listening to the DoubleZero Twitter account? Should we be listening from you at Breakpoint? Any exciting announcements that we should be looking forward to from you guys?
Yeah, I mean, definitely follow the Twitter account. We have a lot of good stuff coming out from there, from videos to new network link announcements, all that type of thing. We will have some announcements this year at Breakpoint and some of the technical conferences that precede Breakpoint. So if you're going to be joining in the UAE or if you're just going to be watching online, like pay attention. We'll have some cool stuff coming out there. And yeah, if you work for a protocol or if you're a major whale in a specific protocol and interested in exploring what DoubleZero might be able to do, we'd love to talk too. DoubleZero.xyz, there's a whole way to get in touch, whether you're a validator or want to contribute fiber or a protocol that wants to chat with us. And my DMs are always open on Twitter as well.
Nice. Awesome. Very cool. So great for you to join us. Check out DoubleZero on all the outlets that Austin mentioned. We're going to be keeping a close eye on it on Messari. So thank you very much for coming on.
Thank you. Appreciate it.